I think a funny bit to start this video on would be to say something like, hey, you want to see what a real difficult game is? Screw your Souls-likes and your level die God Hand run. Check this out instead. And then just show me messing up a jump for half an hour. Ninja Gaiden and difficulty are two terms that feel weirdly stuck together. Whenever I hear anyone talk about any of these games, I typically see the challenge brought up as one of their key characteristics, which is inherently interesting because I feel like you don't really see that often touted as the main appeal in a lot of action games, strangely enough. When really, it's an aspect that sort of feels like a no-brainer. Difficulty is of course a part of all action games at one point or another, but with games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, and basically all of Platinum's output, style and flashiness lies at the heart of their combat systems. It's the primary motivator on a first playthrough, usually. And again, that's not discounting their difficulty, but more so to frame it in a different context, because Ninja Gaiden is pretty different in that sense. Action games generally want to test you and put you into tougher situations that push your knowledge of the game to its limits. Was that Goku? And sure, there are games out there that do this better than some others, but the core idea of building a framework of gameplay that gets additions and further challenges is broadly what makes an action game tick. What exactly makes an action game tricky ranges though, from encounter design steadily evolving to throw tougher enemies at you or increasing the variety of enemy types that may be present in a battle, forcing you to juggle a ton of different approaches and methods to dealing with those enemies. Another angle is through the combat systems themselves and the nuances that they may have, which require you to learn some fancy jump cancel tech or something in that vein, eventually leading to you learning more advanced community discovered techniques should you want to delve into the game to that degree. Difficulty in action games is typically what drives this sort of growth, because you need the obstacle there in the first place to want to do better, and overcoming harder levels of difficulty through harder modes or understanding complicated techniques are incredible markers for growth. It's not unlike getting better at a fighting game, or I don't know, is there some kind of like tech in The Sims that works out similarly? I don't know. Taking away the ladder in the pool tech? Is that one? Ninja Gaiden is a journey of patience, death, retries, and really, really terrible platforming. I mean, look at this shit. He wills himself to go the complete wrong way. Oh no! It's hyped up for good reason though. It's an action game with some of the most engaging combat I've ever experienced. But it's also a very uneven time in a lot of ways, with levels that can sometimes be a little annoying to get through and bosses that don't really agree with a lot of the game's existing ideas. The core of the action is blisteringly fast, requiring you to balance your offense and defense with extreme precision and make plenty of high-risk, high-reward choices. Then you get big bosses that just sort of do big sweep attacks, have kind of dodgy hitboxes, and try their best to abuse their unblockable attacks or extremely powerful grabs. Then you get some that are hilariously easy to break over your knee, and frankly, it gets kind of sad. This is a game where you get challenges that are either perfectly presented and balanced, a true example of how amazing the action game genre can be, or incredibly infuriating encounters if you don't have the knowledge of how to make it go away. Now, at least one person is going to come in here and say that you just have to get good or learn how this stuff goes, and before this starts, I agree! That's how bullshit in any action game goes. There's not a single series out there that doesn't have a fight that sucks. Complaining about this stuff is half the fun though, and frankly, an action game isn't an action game without it. But while we're here, Ninja Gaiden Black has a lot more of the bad sort of stuff than I expected. Thank God the good stuff is so good, because otherwise this would be a much more controversial video. But screw all that for a minute, because I want to talk about Ninja Gaiden's aesthetic. If I had a nickel for every third-person action adventure game that started on a cliff face with a waterfall nearby, I'd have 2 nickels, which would likely be a lot more if I could remember other games that do that too. Environments have this really subtle but comfy glow as the sky softly illuminates your surroundings, and the starting few levels are especially beautiful as we see the time of day slowly transition from early evening to the dead of night, and I mean that literally. The colors of these first few rooms are genuinely stunning, with bright colors, beautiful artwork, and a cozy glow from the light breaching through the windows, which is then contrasted with these darker rooms lit by candlelight that are decidedly more foreboding, which is fitting because this is where you're likely to have your first real fight. The lighting here really is beautiful in a way that intensely reminds me of the Dreamcast. It's subtle but perfectly sets the mood for these scenes, which Sigma sort of ruins almost straight away. Look at this overblown scene. I wouldn't really mind it on its own terms since there's plenty of really nice details, but I kinda miss the subtlety from Black. This beautiful room in Black is way too bright in Sigma to the point that it's so uncomfortable. Black and Sigma are mostly unified in aesthetics for the rest of the game, so to see the opening mission be so starkly different between the two was certainly jarring. Black certainly has sleeker looking vibes that I think fits in perfectly with the game's overall mood, and the subtlety works well amazingly to contrast how violent this game can be at times. Sometimes witnessing a head flying off with a sunset in the background is just a nice little thing to experience. I wouldn't say that Ninja Gaiden Black is the most violent game in the world by any means, not when we have Mortal Kombat doing its thing and has me clapping like a seal in the corner watching it all go down. But there's still something visceral about what Black does with its gore. It might just be the sheer speed it happens, with Ryu's flying swallow being the main culprit. 10 out of 10 though, to be clear. More heads, more heads, more heads. Something that I think is really cool too is how varied the locations are. We begin the game in a Japanese village, but then transition over to a gigantic airship replete with luxury cabins and fight through to the cargo bay and end up sabotaging the whole thing. We then spend most of this game in this sleepy little town, and by sleepy I of course mean covered in ninjas that want to kill you. Aesthetically, there's real variety here, and while I don't think the game gets it right all the time, with the tombs and the military base being two examples of kind of boring areas visually, the variety here is still impressive. What's nice is that you get Tyrone as a sort of hub city to explore, and while it's not got too many secrets, let's get that straight, to find, it still gives me the vibe of something like Station Square in Sonic Adventure. And that's really funny because this game was originally going to release on the Dreamcast before becoming an Xbox exclusive, so there is grounds to that comparison, which Sigma basically gets rid of entirely, for the record. And yes, I do think this is a distinct downgrade in almost every way. Even the UI and menus for Sigma look way worse in comparison. Everything is way too loud, too saturated, and ultimately lacks the really cool contrast that Black's menus have. I ended up playing both versions for this video though, so you'll see clips from both throughout. I think they are both key to experiencing this game, with positives and negatives to both versions. I'm not going to spend like 50 years getting into all of the differences in this video, since I care more about the broader experience at play here, but if you want to play the first game for yourself, I'd say you can't go totally wrong with either version, but you should probably play Black first. That is the better one. Go do that. Ninja Gaiden is all about acting fast and fluid in whichever situation you happen to be in. You have to make full use of Ryu's moves to evade attacks, maneuver the battlefield, and get close to your enemy for the killing blow. This is seriously some of the smoothest movement in any action game I have ever experienced, and it's interesting how that alone sets it apart from its contemporaries. Jumping or rolling, or if you want to get really crazy, jumping and rolling at the same time, lets you cover a ton of ground quickly, but charging directly towards an enemy like this is still a recipe for getting hit at some point. So you need to make use of the environment too. Wall running into dodge roll jumps, coming at enemies from different angles, or even making use of another enemy as a stepping stool to getting to the one you actually want. It's no joke to say that most of a combat encounter's difficulty comes from positioning, and it's something that is hard to learn at the start, mainly because the game never really teaches you any of these nuances. You kinda just have to feel around and figure them out yourself, which is cool. It's nice when a game does let you through the front doors without explaining the rules to death. That always runs the risk of a player feeling alienated and taken to Reddit to voice their grievances, but I think Ninja Gaiden is an experience that caters to people that want something to push their shit in a lot more than the average player. There's a really satisfying layer of depth to the movement in Ninja Gaiden that subconsciously forces you to get really good at it eventually. And when you do, dodging bullets and breaking through an enemy's defenses genuinely feels incredible. It's one of those times where a character's mobility that's only usually seen in a cutscene actually becomes reality when the controls get thrown back to you. Which is funny when you're starting out and making those first few mistakes, because I definitely did not feel like a badass ninja at the start. Look how bad this gameplay is. But I think the game does an incredible job at giving you tough situations to learn from fast. The first level has moments where you'll be ambushed in places the camera doesn't even show you, or small rooms where things feel a little more claustrophobic than you might expect. But this then takes an interesting turn when you realize that the environment is just another one of Ryu's weapons. Smaller enclosed spaces give you more places to wall run, wall hop, and generally more avenues of evading enemy attacks, which makes larger open spaces feel so much more daunting in later sections of the game. Black is also an incredibly violent game at times, with Ryu decapitating guys left and right while eyeing up the next. And it's awesome. It's also a nice visual tell for when an enemy is actually dead and done, because with how fast-paced this combat is, it can sometimes be a little hard to know if you killed an enemy, so thank god there are visual tells like that. Sigma got rid of that though for the human enemies because of course it did. My joy could only last so long. Wait, why am I wanting decapitation so bad? Is this what I've become? That feels weird. So Ryu has a ton of mobility, and working that into a strong defense is key to survival. But weaving that in with an equally strong offense is just as important. Making use of the opening provided by that mobility is arguably the harder part of the game to learn, as a lot of enemies are designed to catch you off guard when you attack, either by straight up dodging you or having a quick attack designed to snap you in half during a startup animation. That's sort of the gamble you have to take a lot of the time though. Risk a quick attack and get off a combo, usually one that leads into an aerial combo finished with an Azuna drop, because that's just what we do here. Or charge up an ultimate technique and be rewarded with a big combo with plenty of iframes. Some enemies are best dealt with option A, some with option B. And then there's option C, which is to get into a ball and cry when nothing seems to work. Finding quick ways to get through these situations is part of the fun though, and it's something that never really gets old. I would happily say that the type of action that Ninja Gaiden supplies is almost the exact kind I want. And when I started to get comfortable in the framework, it became a sincerely incredible feeling. Throw in a bunch of really cool weapons too, like the Dragon Sword, the Lunar Staff, Nunchucks, Dabliaro, and Sigma's biggest addition, which is the dual katanas, and you've got a lot of combat flavors to work with. I'm boring, so I stuck with the starting weapon for a lot of the runtime, but I can see myself doing runs with other weapons too to try and challenge myself. Each one has its own game plan with a full combo list and unique characteristics. Luna, for example, is a staff with a ton of attacks that hit enemies with individual strikes a lot. However, these attacks are, well, they tend to be really easily blocked by a lot of enemies, so the plan becomes all about getting past those defenses and catching enemies off guard. The timing at play becomes a lot more strategic than the Dragon Sword's approach usually is. Also, the Vigorian Flail is just busted. It's just busted. I wish I used this more. Sincerely, it is that good. What I really like about the weapons here are that you really don't need to bother with any of the ones you don't really vibe with. I am sure that there is a meta out there involving some weapons versus others on certain enemies and bosses, but if you're not a nerd, that doesn't really matter, does it? Got him. But in a way, that feeds into one of the core tentpoles of what makes this game work to begin with, and that's knowledge. Any action game, be it character or otherwise, revolves around knowledge to a certain extent. Knowing the key weakness of an enemy or a tactic that works especially well is the meta for most action games. But Ninja Gaiden's difficulty reinforces those ideas a lot more than the average action game. This doesn't come through in obvious ways though, because so much of this game is about careful positioning and timing like I mentioned before. Enemies don't have weaknesses so much as they have openings that Ryu can exploit to dole out combos. And because of how fast-paced combat can be, and how punishing mistakes usually are, it makes those small victories feel all the more important. Now you do have ways of getting a breather every now and then with projectiles that can help force enemies to block or back off, plus there's the Nimpos which make Ryu invulnerable while he prepares a big spell. But part of getting really good at Ninja Gaiden is optimizing every little moment you have to either attack, stay moving, or charge an attack. I think part of what makes Ninja Gaiden really hard to bounce to after playing action games of other kinds is the pace of combat, because here you'll want to spend as much time defending as you do attacking, which is something that took me a little while to learn. Enemies open themselves up to all sorts of attacks as long as you block and know when to avoid their attacks, which ultimately does take a lot of patience. Now all of this goes for basically every combat encounter. What this does not apply to is Ninja Gaiden's boss fights, which are things that I will not spend any energy in this video defending. Basically every lesson you learn in this game's usual combat encounters is made somewhat redundant in the boss fights. Some bosses are just strange gimmick fights that play out like a weird mix of an Ocarina of Time boss mixed with the Harrier fight from MGS2, and others let you stand in a corner while you charge up an attack, cleave a fifth of the health bar, and just rinse and repeat. There are highlights, like the fight against Doku is fun, but that highlights a different problem in the sense that some bosses don't meaningfully react to your hits and just sort of stand there taking the punishment while ready to whip out their own at any time. It does not feel very good. So when you get bosses that don't necessarily react to Ryu's attacks much at all, and either hide in a tunnel for a while or do some other kind of bullshit move that's hard to see coming, you end up with fights that are difficult to understand on the same level as the rest of the game. They can also be trivialized with Nimpos in your first playthrough, which honestly feels like the intended solution a lot of the time. I assumed bosses would mostly consist of learning to evade a lot of patterns and attacks to wait for a key opening to emerge where you could make use of your patience and restraint and let it all out at the right time. Instead, bosses tend to be kind of awfully designed elements of the game that should have been the game's highlight. And while I'm complaining, the platforming in Ninja Gaiden is insulting sometimes. Wall runs don't work properly on walls that aren't completely flat for a start, causing Ryu to start at the wrong angle and sometimes jump off prematurely. Other times you're forced into doing a jump that requires absolute precision with tools that do not offer that courtesy. There were times when I wasn't sure if what I was doing was an exploit or if the game actually wanted me to do the thing I was trying. And when you're there for 30 minutes trying to perfect the angle of a wall run within a system where doing that is nearly impossible, I don't know what else to say other than I'm losing my mind. I don't want to spend too long on the aspects that don't work perfectly though. Again, every action game has stuff like this at the end of the day. And I'm not really that bothered by janky stuff like this most of the time. I think it was just so against my initial expectations. And that's sort of the problem with expectation in the first place, really, isn't it? This is stuff that is easily fixed by getting good. And when I went through these areas again in Sigma, I cut down my time here by half. When people talk about Ninja Gaiden's difficulty, I am sure these elements definitely come into play by making the experience feel more punishing in a certain way. But they aren't what makes the game difficult at its core. Challenge is something that an action game needs to supply to keep the loop engaging, and when a player becomes more powerful, the game needs to supplement that growth with new enemies to keep them on their toes, and new difficulty modes to bring a new dimension to the challenge. Ninja Gaiden does this incredibly effectively, to the point that even with all the monotonous stuff I just mentioned, I still have plans to go back and tackle those challenges because the core loop and idea of the game is so much fun. But what even is the point of difficulty in the first place if I'm constantly chasing mechanical perfection? Where's the finish line here? Is it when I complete all of the game's content, or simply when I feel satisfied with what I've done? The answer is, there is no answer, at least not one that you can give me. But it's an interesting thing to poke at, since challenge is at the core of what Ninja Gaiden is, and at the core of most action games, really. That then forces you to reanalyze your arsenal and make use of moves you may not have noticed before, or maybe just approach things from a more patient perspective. The difficulty in these situations stems from figuring out what the right move is at this point. Do you patiently wait out an attack and attempt to dodge it and answer back when there's an opening, or do you continue to press the aggression and stop the enemy from responding? Both can work, but both also require you to be devoted to those decisions. If your ability to block and dodge is weak, you can accidentally open yourself up to an attack. And likewise, if your offense is misplaced, an enemy can dodge or block too and hit you right back. It's here that combat sort of blurs the line between being engaging and sometimes annoying before you really know better. But I do think that, again, Ninja Gaiden intuits this better for me than a lot of other action games that do similar things. Honestly, if the bosses were better and the platforming more refined, I could easily place Ninja Gaiden Black above the likes of DMC3, God Hand, and, of course,
The Bouncer.
Does difficulty engage you more or less into a game? Do moments of adversity create pockets of excitement and spontaneity, or anxiety and frustration? It depends on the game, the person, the mood, the aesthetic, and most importantly of all, the quality of the difficulty itself. And in that sense, I would say that Ninja Gaiden is a very high quality, difficult game. Mainly because its encounters are entirely fair, as most enemies are about as lethal as Ryu is. But if you aren't able to keep up with them, then of course it's going to feel frustrating to play. Luckily, I do think that Ninja Gaiden's downtime and annoying aspects don't really drag down the quality of the game too much, because the combat is so fun and satisfying to get better at. It makes losing feel like another step to getting better, as opposed to a frustrating progress blocker. For me, difficulty is useless if the adversity isn't fun in the first place. Ninja Gaiden gives you the tools and the feedback to not only improve on your fighting ability, but also have fun while doing it, which is such a difficult thing to balance, and once again, I think Team Ninja really managed to crack the code nearly perfectly here. with some glaring stumbles here and there, but I'm moving on from that. I've learned to forgive and forget. Above all else, Ninja Gaiden is a satisfying time that I will be diving back into at various points to see what else it has to offer. After all, I need to get this sick demon outfit in Sigma. Look at this thing! It's so cool! Hello to everyone who is now hearing this message. I have opened up a Patreon that you can go check out right now that has some cool benefits, including access to future content polls that decide the next video that I work on, which is technically how this video now exists thanks to everyone that voted for it in the YouTube poll, which you can't really tell right now because you guys voted for Chaos Legion after I took the initial result. But yep, that's fine. That video's coming up next. Those will now happen on Patreon because I needed to give it some exclusive features. That's just how it is. Other than that, you'll get a shout out at the end of these videos that will get you featured at the end and sometimes maybe during. In the middle of a video. Who knows? So a huge shout out to Trans Witch Sammy and Aaron Jones for supporting me over there. It truly helps a lot and continues to keep this channel going. You're literally putting food on my table and paying for my next weird game. Ghoulies Game Fund subs will also gain access to my video scripts so you can see juicy behind the scenes content on how I write videos, the sort of notes I make, and the stuff that I cut out for one reason or another. I am still extremely new to Patreon, so I am sure that I'll add some more benefits and features over there as time goes on. I've got some ideas to give it more value, but one thing I never want to do is create video content that is exclusively for that platform. I am not locking anything away like that. I am already immensely grateful to anyone that even watches my videos and considers checking out what I do. And I strongly believe that supporting me in this way should be entirely optional on your part. So I don't want to take anything away from this channel at all. Please only support me on Patreon if you feel 100% comfortable doing so. I know that we're all going through our own hard times, and honestly, simply watching my videos is enough support to keep me going. Thank you so much for getting here, and I shall see you in the next one.